This story is so familiar, not only in Christian circles, but in our world, that we have laws that are called Samaritan laws. To where if you help someone, you're a good Samaritan. And I don't know about you, but I'm an American, not a Samaritan. Okay, using the definition that Nancy used with the children. What makes you a Samaritan? She said being from Samaria. Well, I'm not from Samaria. But yet this story still fits all of us, does it not? About how do we do good for others. And this being a very familiar story, I'm sure you're sitting out there right now saying, well, this has been a good Sunday to skip because I've heard this preached on so many times, and here I'm sitting here. Well, I want to take a little different slant to the story this time, so maybe you won't think that you've wasted your time for coming and hearing a very familiar story being preached again. We've been talking about, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, about community connections and building walls and asking, what do people find when they attend Harper Chapel? And we've been asking, what's the purpose of what Nehemiah did after the walls were torn down for over 100 years in Jerusalem? And we've kind of come to the conclusion that some of that is because it makes a better place, brings back honor to people's lives, and builds them up to have a relationship with God the way God wants them to have a relationship. But today I want us to look at the age-old question, who is our neighbor? And right away, whenever we think about who is our neighbor, and we think about all the things that we've been taught over the years, right away we say, everybody in the world. It doesn't matter whether they live next door to us, sit in a pew next to us, or whether they are over in Mozambique, Africa, or in Germany, or wherever they are our neighbor, and we're supposed to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And we know that that's kind of difficult to do. But some of the difficulty we can kind of explain away by saying, well, they're really so far away that I can't do much for them anyway. I'm just one little old person, and those people that are living out someplace else that the military's taking care of, we'll just let them do that. Or those people out in California, or those people in North Dakota or South Dakota. You know, those aren't really my neighbors because I'll never meet them anyway. And as I got to thinking about that and the changes that we can make in one person's life here at Harper Chapel, we just might touch somebody's life in Iraq because we have some men and women from Harper Chapel serving there. And whenever I was a little boy, thinking back on this, when I was a little boy growing up in Flora, Illinois, I never thought the day would ever come that I would live in Missouri. I was from Illinois. Especially not have the great opportunity to live at such a great place as Osage Beach. So maybe we need to really think about who our neighbor is this morning, because everyone is our neighbor. Now, the religious leaders in this story chose not to be a neighbor to the Samaritan. As the priest walked by, he kind of turned his head, and he didn't do much about it. At least that's what the parable or the story tells us. And the Levite, another religious leader of that day, he did the same thing. He passed by on the other side of the road, kind of turned his head, said, you know, I can almost hear him saying, I wish I could stop and help him, but I know what he's going to want, and my pastor's concern fund is dry. I'm going to have to tell him no, so I'm not even going to get started. And away he went. He made that choice. But I think today what we need to think about is not just who our neighbor is, knowing the answer to that, but to maybe answer this question. Who do we choose our neighbor to be? And whenever I ask that, I'm asking, who do you choose to be your neighbor that you're willing to help? And who is the one that you're willing or turning away, not willing to help? For whatever reason. Because you see, the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan made a choice that day, did they not? They made a choice to pass on the other side of the road or to stop and help. Now, the Samaritan made another choice. This other choice that the Samaritan made was not only to bandage him, but to use some oil that he was probably carrying and his wine that he was carrying, probably for his own sustenance, and gave that to the man as well, or to the Samaritan. And then the next morning when he got up, he gave out some of his money and said, take care of this person. And whenever I return, I'm going to give you even more. This Samaritan made several choices on how he was going to treat this neighbor. It wasn't just getting into the hospital, but it was going back and making sure that he was taken care of properly. So it's about choices. Not just knowing who our neighbor is, but what are we going to do about our neighbor? Are we going to ask them if they've got a relationship with God? Or are we going to say, I really don't care because they're not worth my time? Or are we really too busy at times to stop and say, I'm one of God's people. How about you? It's about our community connection. I want to read a story that I received on an email this last week. Some of you may have already read this, because if it's out on the internet, it's probably available to a lot of people. But it's titled Breakfast at McDonald's. This is a good story, and I'm told that it's a true one. And so I want you to hear what happens in this story, and then we're going to talk about it for just a moment. The story begins. I am a mother of 3 children, ages 14, 12, and 3, and have recently completed my college degree. The last class I had to take was sociology. The teacher was absolutely inspiring with the qualities that I wish every human being had been graced with. Her last project of the term was called Smile. The class was asked to go out and smile at 3 people and document their reactions. I'm a very friendly person and always smile at everyone and say hello anyway, so I thought this would be a piece of cake, literally. Soon after we were assigned the project, my husband, youngest son, and I went to McDonald's one crisp March morning. It was just our way of sharing special playtime with our son. We were standing in line waiting to be served when all of a sudden everyone around us began to back away, and then even my husband did. I didn't move an inch. An overwhelming feeling of panic welled up inside of me as I turned to see why they had moved. And as I turned around, I smelled a horrible, dirty body smell. And there standing behind me were 2 poor homeless men. And as I looked down at the short gentleman close to me, he was smiling. His beautiful sky blue eyes were full of God's light as he searched for acceptance. He said, "Good day," as he counted the few coins he had been clutching. The second man fumbled with his hands as he stood behind his friend. I realized the second man was mentally challenged, and the blue-eyed gentleman was his salvation. I held my tears as I stood there with them. The young lady at the counter asked him what he wanted. He said, "Coffee is all, miss." Because that was all they could afford. And if they wanted to sit in the restaurant and warm up, they had to buy something. He just wanted to be warm. Then I really felt it. The compulsion was so great, I almost reached out and embraced the little man with the blue eyes. That is when I noticed all eyes in the restaurant were set on me, judging my every action. I smiled and asked the young lady behind the counter to give me 2 more breakfast meals on a separate tray. And I then walked around the corner to the table that the men had chosen as a resting spot. I put the tray on the table and laid my hand on the blue-eyed gentleman's cold hand. And he looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Thank you." I leaned over, began to pat his hand, and said, "I did not do this for you. God is here." I started to cry as I walked, God is here working through me to give you hope. I started to cry as I walked away to join my husband and son. And when I sat down by my husband, he smiled at me and said, "That's why God gave you to me, honey, to give me hope." We held hands for a moment, and at that moment, in that time, we knew that only because of grace that we had been given what we were able to give. We were not churchgoers, but we are believers. That day showed me the pure light of God's sweet love. I returned to college on the last evening of class with this story in hand. I turned in my project and the instructor read it. Then she looked at me and said, "Can I share this?" I slowly nodded as she got the attention of the class. She began to read it, and that is when I knew that we as human beings are being a part of God, sharing this need to heal people and to be healed. In my own way, I had touched the people at McDonald's, my son, the instructor, and every soul that shared in the classroom on the last night I spent as a college student. I graduated with one of the biggest lessons I could ever learn: unconditional acceptance. Unconditional acceptance. That's what Jesus meant when he told this person, this teacher of the law that was questioning him, "Who is my neighbor?" And he shared this story with them. And the teacher of the law got it. And he said, "Well, the last guy, the Samaritan, he had mercy on the person that fell among the robbers. That Samaritan had unconditional acceptance of the person in need." And Jesus said, "Then go and do likewise. Go and have unconditional acceptance yourself." See, this story, as I read it, kind of reminded me of that Samaritan. Because you see, this woman wasn't a churchgoer. And sometimes we feel like the only people that are really our neighbors and that we can reach out to are the people that are in church with us, because they're the only ones that really deserve it. I mean, after all, they're our friends, right? And we have unconditional acceptance for them most of the time. So in our community connections, who do we choose as our neighbor? Who do we choose to help? By what criteria do we choose our neighbors? Is it because they live next door to us? Or is it because they go to the same church that we go to? Or believe the same things that we believe? Or is it simply because they have some need that needs to be filled that may also fill one of ours? So as we are here gathered together today on World Communion Sunday, the first Sunday of October, I want us to come and take this sacrament with a question in our heart and asking God to help us figure it out. And that question being, do I have unconditional acceptance of those that God is placing in my path. You know, I found that to be one of the most gracious, rewarding things that I've ever prayed about. But also one of the most challenging for my own faith. And that is to pray that God, during the day, sometime would put somebody in my path that needs to hear the gospel. And I didn't say someone from Harper Chapel or someone from Osage Beach or someone from my family. I just said, put someone in my path that needs to hear the gospel. Are we really ready? Do I really have unconditional acceptance? As you take the Holy Sacrament today, ask yourself that question. And then ask God how you can improve on it and grow in faith as you help your neighbor.